When you think of France, what comes to mind? Probably things like luxury, romance, amazing food, right? But what if that perfect postcard image is actually hiding a much, much harsher economic reality? Today, we're going to dive into a source that makes a pretty shocking argument that France is a country that is quietly, politely, and steadily going broke. Let's get into it.
So, right out of the gate, the analysis we're looking at today throws a massive punch. It says, hey, you think you're looking at a global superpower? Think again. It suggests that behind that fancy facade is a nation dealing with some serious economic decay. And that really sets the stage for a totally different way of looking at the French economy.
And this slide, wow, it just lays out the whole conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got the fantasy, the global brand of France we all know, and on the other, the reality that this source describes, a middle class that's basically evaporating, its most ambitious people packing their bags and leaving, and a state that's teetering on the edge of a major fiscal crisis.
So, where does a decline like this even begin? Well, according to this source, it all starts with the average worker's paycheck. Let's take a look at what it calls the Great Wage Flattening. Okay, so the key idea here is a word you probably haven't heard before, smicardization. It's what happens when the floor of the economy, that's the minimum wage, or SMIC in France, keeps getting pushed up, but the ceiling doesn't move at all. And the result? A massive compression of wages, squeezing everybody in the middle together.
Now, what's so wild about this slide is just how tiny that gap actually is. We're talking about a net difference of only about 550 euros a month between someone working a minimum wage job and the person earning the dead center median salary. I mean, the source argues this just kills motivation. Why would you study for years and take on more responsibility for such a small reward?
And listen, this is not some small niche problem. A staggering 17% of the entire French workforce is now earning the minimum wage, and millions more are just barely above it. The safety net has essentially become the national standard.
So how does a decent salary get whittled down so much? Well, the source has a pretty dramatic name for it, a financial murder scene. It starts with something called the superbrute. That's the total cost to the employer. Then huge chunks get taken out for the employer's social security contributions, then the employee's contributions, and then finally income tax. By the time that money actually hits your bank account, almost half the value of your labor has just vanished into the state's coffer.
This metaphor from the source just captures the argument perfectly, doesn't it? An economic boa constrictor. It's this idea that the insane tax burden creates a vicious cycle. Companies can't afford to pay people more, so employees have very little to spend, and the whole economy just stagnates.
Okay, let's move on to the second big theme, and you'll see how this all connects. It's the idea that France has basically become a museum economy, choosing to sell luxury handbags and welcome tourists while its factories shut down one by one.
I mean, this chart really puts it in stark perspective. Manufacturing is barely 10% of France's GDP. That's about half of its neighbor, Germany. And the source claims this wasn't an accident. It's the result of a deliberate 40-year policy to bet everything on a post-industrial, service-based society. And the consequences laid out here are just severe. The loss of all those factory jobs didn't just hurt the economy. It completely hollowed out entire regions, creating what the source calls peripheral ghost towns. And all that despair, it fueled the political rage that eventually exploded into movements like the Yellow Vests.
So, this deindustrialization, this economic stagnation, it all leads to a pretty grim reality, which begs the question, according to this analysis, what is France's most valuable export today?
The answer? Its own people. The source calls it a massive brain drain of France's best and brightest, the engineers, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, who are all leaving for better opportunities in places like the US, the UK, and Switzerland.
And that brings us to the third part of this whole argument, the massive systemic problems at the state level. The source identifies these as ticking time bombs just waiting to go off.
Just look at this timeline. The source points out a fact that is just mind-blowing. France has not passed a balanced budget since 1974. That's half a century, 50 years of spending more money than it brings in. And that has led to a public debt that has just ballooned to over 113% of its entire GDP.
So where is all this borrowed money going? Well, a massive 32% of the country's entire economic output goes to social protection. That's the highest rate in the world. The source has this great line for it. It calls it a Rolls-Royce welfare state with a Peugeot economy, basically arguing that it's a model that is mathematically impossible to sustain.
The pension system is a perfect example of this. It's a pay-as-you-go system, but as you can see here, the demographics have completely flipped. Back in the 1960s, you had 4 workers paying in for every 1 retiree taking money out. Today, it's just 1.7 workers, and that number is still falling. The math, it just doesn't work. It can't.
And here's the real kicker. For decades, the deal in France was this. We're going to take a lot of your money in taxes, but in return, we'll give you absolutely world-class public services. The source argues that this social contract is now totally void. People are paying luxury prices for services that are crumbling, from 20-hour waits in the ER to plummeting education scores.
So, for the final section, the source zooms all the way out and asks a really critical question. Is France just some weird outlier, or is it a warning sign for the rest of us, the canary in the coal mine for the developed world?
Before we even get to the economic stuff, just think about the psychological toll. The source points out that year after year, global polls find that the French are the most pessimistic people on Earth, often more pessimistic than people living in actual war zones. And that kind of pessimism, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It stifles spending, it stifles risk-taking, it stifles everything.
And here it is, the main takeaway of this whole analysis. The source isn't really just talking about France. It's using France as a kind of time machine, arguing that it's simply further down a path that many other Western nations are already starting to walk.
I mean, do any of these symptoms look familiar to you? An aging population, the hollowing out of industry, a national addiction to deficit spending, deep, angry political polarization. The source calls these the key features of the French disease, and it warns that this disease is contagious.
So the final diagnosis from our source is, well, it's pretty stark. The whole French model is living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The illusion of wealth is only being held up by massive amounts of debt, and the question is no longer if a major correction is coming, but when.
And that leaves all of us with a really provocative final thought. It's so easy to be fooled by a beautiful image, by a pretty postcard. But this analysis is urging us all to look past that postcard and actually check the balance sheet, not just for France, but maybe, just maybe, for our own countries as well.